Pleased to have Dr. Andrew Smith with us, who's a reader in the University of Westminster in tourism and events, which is an exciting kind of area to be in. He's a geographer originally from Cambridge, went to Sheffield, Hallam and Sheffield, a kind of joint PhD program, which has brought him into the leisure field really, somewhat to his surprise I think as much as the rest of us. But he's written a lot on urban themes and published very widely, as you can tell by the fact that he's already a reader. His sort of three areas of expertise are sports events, destination images, well, we need to bring him down to Cardiff really to start to improve our destination image, and city tourism. So those are the areas that he's specialised in, but being a Cambridge geographer, he knows a huge amount more about what's going on in London. And he's here tonight to tell us about the London 2012 Olympics and regeneration, which is a very exciting and, dare I say, controversial topic.
No, definitely.
Certainly, having spent the weekend in London with the urban design students, it's the only place in Britain where there is any regeneration, so it's rather convenient, I think. Andrew.
Thank you. Just take this. Okay, so first of all, let's just like to say thank you to Carl and the organisers for inviting me to speak. Obviously, Cardiff's got a really strong pedigree in planning and geography, so I was really interested in coming to talk to you, and I'm really pleased with the turnout. I'm putting that very much down to the Olympic effect rather than the sort of anything to do with the University of Westminster or myself, but it's good of you to come out on a relatively cold night. Yesterday there were no trains at all, so I was starting to worry about whether I would actually be here at all or how I would make my way to Cardiff without the help of Southwest trains, but fortunately everything seemed to work out okay today. So as John was saying, I've got quite a strange background in some ways, and now I'm working in a School of Architecture in the built environment, but I've got a really strong interest in events and other sort of big regeneration projects, really, dating back to some work I did in the 1990s in Sheffield, Manchester and Birmingham, all cities which were really trying to use events, new sports facilities, other sort of quite innovative sort of developments in order to sort of kickstart regeneration and to sort of reinvent themselves as post-industrial cities. So the reason I'm saying that is just because I don't want you to think I'm like one of those awful London bores who comes from London and sort of tells you they think they know everything, but they never leave London and they spend the whole time sort of never leaving the perimeter of the M25. So I do feel I've got a bit of, of experience of British cities outside London. So I wanted to remind you of that. Today, what I'm going to try and say to you is, or talk to you about, is this very strange relationship between major events and urban regeneration. If you think about it, major events, what are they? They're short-term occasions. They're quite frivolous things, really. Regeneration is a very important, substantial endeavour, a very long-term endeavour that affects people's lives and that is incredibly significant. So in some ways, it's quite, as you can already see, it's quite an awkward juxtaposition. But for whatever reason, events have become sort of part of regeneration. They are tools, they are things that are used as part of regeneration and practice. So that's quite interesting to me, and that's something that I've tried to explore in some of my work. So normally we've got this idea that events help regeneration in some ways, but in the book that I wrote recently that was published last year, one thing I was trying to argue was that actually often the dialectic works the other way around. Actually often regeneration helps events more than events help regeneration. So we often get regeneration bolted onto events in order to sort of help justify them and often to help cities win the rights to stage them. So we've got to think about it in sort of slightly more sophisticated terms rather than just think about events as something that can assist regeneration. We also have to think about how regeneration rhetoric, how the discourse of regeneration really affects and helps events. So what's my job really tonight is to try and think through some of this, I suppose a bit more, think it through and think beyond some of the very simplistic ways in which we think about events and regeneration. Obviously, these initiatives get a lot of publicity, and hopefully you all know a lot about various examples because we hear about them in the public sphere. So that's quite interesting as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, I'm going to pick out some themes from the book that I published last year, and just, I haven't got time to tell you everything I said, but I've picked out 3 sort of juicy issues which I want to tell you a little bit more about. And then I want to sort of try and think more specifically about the best way of understanding the London 2012 project. So that project was extremely complicated. It was probably the best part of 12, 15 years worth of endeavour. So I haven't got time to really go through the nuances of it today. So what I want to try and do is pick up 2 ways of understanding it, really. One very realistic and quite pessimistic interpretation, and one which is slightly more positive and idealistic. So that will give you a little bit of a teaser about what I'm going to say. Someone's already said to me, oh, I like this picture. I'd like to think I chose it because it said something about, I don't know, the complexity of the project or the impossibility of understanding it through structured, rational thought. But actually, the organisers told me I had to sort of choose an image that represented my talk, so I desperately searched through my image bank and plucked this one out. So it has no particular significance today. I'm not going to talk about Anish Kapoor and Boris Johnson and their strange tower. So these are 2 publications that have come out recently which you might be interested in. They really provide a bit of the basis for what I'm going to talk about today. So you might want to look at the report on the left was a project I led, commissioned by the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, which is a very strange piece of research in some ways, because they asked me to look at what had happened in London and compare it to other practice. But it was an interesting project, partly because it exposed me to the sort of very political nature of this project. You know, the stakes were very high here. You know, the idea of saying things about the Olympics, it made it very clear to me how significant a project this was and how institutions were very, very cautious about saying critical things about them. The book on the right was published last year, and like typical mega event projects, it was delivered over budget and in a real rush to get it delivered on time. But it was delivered on time. I thought it might be a good idea to publish a book on this in 2012, but I was probably mistaken, because for those of you who follow the literature on mega events and regeneration, there was an absolute avalanche of literature last year. So actually it was probably the worst possible time to publish anything on events and regeneration, because it just got lost in the huge swathe of research that came out. Every journal had a special edition on the Olympics. There's a whole range of different 2012 projects that sort of were realised last year. But that's really some of the substance. If you want to follow up some of these pieces of written work, I'll give you the references at the end. But let's just start by thinking a little bit about this relationship between events and regeneration. The first thing to say, obviously, is that there's nothing new about linking a major event and an urban regeneration project. There's not even anything new about doing it in London. Before the Olympics, there were at least 2 extremely large events that were very much justified using the rhetoric of regeneration. So we can look back at a long history of world exhibitions, of garden festivals, of cultural festivals, as well as sport events in the modern times that have been used as part of urban regeneration. Even in South Wales, we've had, who can forget the famous Ebervale Garden Festival, the Rugby World Cup. You know, even in this part of the world, there's been quite a dedicated effort to use. Someone says, I've forgotten. So this is a more frequent practice than you might imagine. So this is quite an interesting quote here, because this was a quote from Herbert Morrison, the sort of leading politician of the time, behind the Festival of Britain, which is the event that's illustrated here. You might recognise this part of London. You can just about see the Houses of Parliament in the distance there, and the Royal Festival Hall in the foreground. And this is really interesting, because as you can see from Herbert Morrison's quote, this is when we start seeing some quite interesting trends emerging. The idea of framing these large regeneration projects. So weirdly enough, we can only justify these projects if we make the case that they're needed. So this started when this was part of this long trend of actually almost talking down areas in order to provide the will and the sort of political consensus needed to actually deliver these sort of large schemes. So this idea of framing is quite interesting. And there's obviously a bit of a contradiction there, isn't there? Because these exercises are meant to be about saying really positive things about cities, but actually the first initial stages of these projects actually often involves sort of trash talking these areas in order to actually build up a case that we need a very, very large intervention in these places in order. So, for the last 12 years, everyone's been talking about East London, isn't it derelict, deprived, isn't it awful, isn't it? When actually, there are various parts of East London which, are relatively affluent in quite a good position to, to develop from. So this whole idea of discourse and language is very, very important. I know some of you here have a real interest and a knowledge of regeneration, and for me, I've been looking at it for several years, and I really think it's probably is best understood, a term best understood as a discourse. Really, it's a language. It's something which has now almost been appropriated by the property industry. Really, say the idea of regeneration is very much a language, and that's also true of events. So one way of understanding events is very much as a sort of narrative, as a story, as a way of talking about things in a place, giving something a very strong, symbolic, emotional meaning. And really that's where the power of events lies. So the combination of this sort of discourse of regeneration and this very strong, powerful, emotional language of the Olympic Games or these other large events, that's an interesting sort of relationship too. So as I said, what I'd like to do really in this presentation is sort of move to the sort of contemporary era and think about some key issues, but also think about what happened in London. I'm presuming that everyone knows the London project fairly well. Is that true? Is that true to say? You understand the basic background. I'm not going to go right back to, Livingston and discussions with the BOA. And don't worry, I'm not going to give you a history of the project, but it's useful to have a bit of a basic understanding. So the issues that I really want to sort of try and tease out, so these are issues that I raised in the book that I published last year. There were obviously other issues too, but these were three which I felt were quite interesting and ones that you might find interesting. So the idea of the book was really to look beyond case studies, to sort of say, which is quite ironic because tonight I'm looking at a case study, but this idea that we actually need to understand some overarching themes and ideas about this practice of using events in regeneration, rather than just looking at Barcelona and looking at these cases in isolation. You often get these books that just go through, we've got Montreal, and go through the LA and Barcelona. It limits and restricts our understanding to some extent. So these were sort of cross-cutting themes across different examples, and obviously it's interesting to see how they play out, or how they did play out in East London, and how they relate to the very, very significant 2012 project, which obviously is an ongoing project. So I can explain them very quickly now. The first one is this idea of using an event and actually having to convert and reconvert event spaces, which is obviously something that has to happen with these projects. We build things for an event, and then we have to think about how they can be adapted for long-term uses. So there's this idea of conversion and how compatible event space is with everyday use in the long term. The second key issue is this idea of time. We know that as part of the power of these events is the deadline that they inevitably set. We sort of say, right, opening ceremony on this date, therefore we have to have done all this. So the power of them often lies in their temporal frame. And obviously that's related to this idea that maybe speeds things up. John was telling me before that he thinks development and regeneration in Cardiff is notoriously slow. I don't know if you, but there's this idea that events, one of their powerful agents, is that they are known to have this sort of supposed accelerating effect, that they speed up urban change. And finally, we've got this idea of exceptionality. So don't worry, I'm not going to get into a gambit and legal theories about states of exception, but I'm interested in this idea that staging an event often gives us this license to do something different. Actually, we make an exception because it's the Games or because it's the World Cup, or we're allowed to do things slightly differently, and that provides, both a positive and a negative angle to the way in which, things unfold. So let me start with that first issue, this idea of conversion. So one question I've always tried to ask in my work is, well, what happens when we include an event in regeneration? How is that different from other large-scale regeneration projects that we see throughout the world? So I think there are lots of interesting specific things that are different, and obviously people talk about this galvanizing effect of an event, the idea that we gain civic support, we build political will, that we actually have we do things differently, and the event gives us this focus and gives us this excuse really to do something different. But what we often don't talk about is that this really isn't a very magic formula. When we have to stage a major event, that really complicates things. It really complicates regeneration. It causes us some very practical problems. It's a hugely inefficient thing to do, isn't it? Saying, okay, we need to regenerate this area. What we'll do is stage an event in order to sort of unlock funds. And so we have to then stage this event, even though what we're interested in really is the outcome, which is new facilities, new services, better quality of life, better public realm, whatever it may be. So actually that is a very, very inefficient way of undergoing urban change. That if we're not really interested in the event, what we're interested in is the outcome of the event. It sort of confuses things. So in the contemporary, we've learned from about 50 years of practice, and now the rhetoric of these development corporations often in charge of these projects is that we build for the long term and then adapt the site or sites for the event. So that's the sort of rhetoric. But in reality, what happens is that we do build for the event, and then we have to rebuild after the event, and we have to spend time and money converting and reconverting facilities which weren't really suited to their to the long-term sort of development of the area. So we get a great deal of confusion, I think, about what is spending on the event and what is spending on genuine long-term facilities, services, environments. So, for example, a very good example is the constant, and tell me if you've heard this, but there's a constant refrain in London from the organisers of London 2012 that 75 pence in every pound spent on the Olympic Park went into the regeneration and renewal of East London. Now, I spent a bit of time in the summer, this is a tragic use of my summer, but I spent a bit of time in the summer picking my way through that claim, and actually it transpires that your 75 pence in every pound, so supposedly 75% of the spending on regeneration, actually includes things like the media centre, car parks for the IOC members. Everything that was basically going to stay long term was factored into that 75p. So really, it's 75p on every pound spent on things that are permanent and that won't disappear, that aren't transient event facilities. But actually, did that area really need a big grey box, or did it really need a large car park? Did it really need this? These things are justified using the language of regeneration rather than, really thinking through what that actually means. And if we're trying to achieve sort of integrated urban space that's linked into its surroundings, events are actually a very strange choice of thing to use. What makes a good event space? Well, in the modern era, it's about one that can be locked down very easily, one where we've got a very clear perimeter, one which is very spectacular, one which is very makes people feel like they're entering a new world. This is what makes good event space. When we go to these spaces, we want to feel like we're in a magical world of a World Expo or an Olympic Games. We don't want to feel like we're in East London. So that actually makes it, in some ways, a very inappropriate thing to use to achieve integrated, everyday urban space in the long term, isn't it? There's a bit of a mismatch there. Just finally on this, and I don't know if you know the backstory about this project, the Zaha Hadid pool, but I think it's this perfect illustration of some of the inefficiencies involved in the process, isn't it? If you think about it, we forget that this was one of the few facilities commissioned before London won the bid for the Games. So actually at this point we didn't really have a user or even a client for the project. We were asking an architect to build something, even though we didn't really know who it was for or what it would. Well, we knew what it would do, but we didn't really know who the users or client would be. And during the event, we can go into all the cost overruns and the problems with the roof and all these typical problems that come with these iconic designs. But during the Games, the funniest thing here was that beautiful design was all hidden. So at the very moment that project was meant to be this visible icon, it was hidden by these temporary seating structures because obviously the organisers decided they wanted to get more people inside the venue, not unreasonably, so they could actually see this event happening rather than just the 3,000 or 4,000 seats that were provided in the permanent structure. So they've got this crazy situation whereby you've got an event venue built at a massive, great expense using a certain design. That actually, at a point at which that design is most visible, it's actually clouded in this very ugly sort of temporary seating. after the games, just to add to the irony, we're spending a lot of money converting this facility into a local community leisure centre. So now at the point at which the world's attention has left, we're now spending huge amounts of money in London redesigning this facility to make this iconic design suitable for community use, so it can act as a swimming pool for the residents of Newham and other Olympic boroughs. So there's a strange sort of hang on, isn't that the wrong way around? Shouldn't it have been iconic for the event? And so it's iconic for the users of Newham, but it's actually, when everyone was looking at it, it was incredibly ugly. We could have just had a very cheap box with a swimming pool in the bottom for the event, which would have been a far more user-friendly swimming arena. So that, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but it highlights some of these incredible sort of awkwardness of using events. So the second issue was this idea of time, as I said. So as this countdown clock, I don't know if anyone remembers that great comedy series 2012, but this idea where the clock went wrong, that was always a very funny moment, wasn't it? But got this idea of a countdown, this idea of a deadline. So I was at a conference in the summer when the chief planner for Atlanta was talking about, retrospectively, about his involvement in the games there. And he was saying, looking back, ultimately, what did the Olympics bring to us? Well, basically, it brought us a deadline. It meant that we did things that wouldn't have otherwise happened, or it would have taken a lot longer, and we had to do them, and it forced everyone to get it done. And so that was interesting, wasn't it? Because there were maybe some lessons for wider projects there about deadlines. Can we have deadlines without having to stage £10 billion events? Is there a way of having a deadline without going to the inconvenience of staging these world-class events? It's also interesting to hear this idea of acceleration, an event speed things up. So of all the research I did, I think the biggest acceleration was in the Stoke Garden Festival of the 1980s, whereby they claimed that 25 years of work had been done in 2 years, and another city mayors say that 35 years of work were done in 4 years, or there's this constant refrain that an event delivers change effectively because it speeds things up, which obviously is partly true. But remember, a lot of these sites, including the one in London, including Sydney, including sites like the Stade de France, part of Saint-Denis in Paris, these sites take a lot of time to redevelop, and we don't really factor that in. Actually, there's still work being done to make Sydney's Olympic Park sort of vaguely interesting and habitable and a functioning urban community. So that's another 12 years down the line. So although it may speed things up in the initial stages, these things aren't finished at the event. So there's a slight contradiction in the rationale. And remember, there are other problems with accelerated development. For example, there's a danger of rushing things, isn't there? We know, when we rush something, we tend to botch it, don't we, and do a bad job. You're doing a bit of DIY and you're rushing in, looks a bit, tiling's all a bit wonky. And the same applies to these projects. Actually, doing things fast isn't necessarily always the best idea, is it? And remember, one of the key things democratically is that accelerated development makes it harder to involve people in collaborative planning and consultations and in difficult planning decisions. And so this speeding up of things isn't always the sort of panacea it's claimed to be. So time is both part of the reason why events are seen as powerful regeneration tools, but it's also part of the reason why some people really worry about them, because they result in rushed and inconsiderate and undemocratic processes. And the related final sort of theme I wanted to raise was this idea of exceptionality. So we often get this rhetoric around a big event about this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This is a one-off, effectively. I'm very tempted here to adapt. There's quite a famous Tim Vine joke. I don't know if anyone knows Tim Vine. He's a bit of a punster. But he basically makes a joke about one of his friends going on a once-in-a-lifetime holiday and coming back and saying, never again. And there's the same thing about the Olympic Games, and people involved in London will say to you, we were involved in organising a once-in-a-lifetime event, and we understand why now they're called once-in-a-lifetime event, never again sort of thing. So there's quite an interesting dimension to that rhetoric, this idea of fatefulness. This is about rhetoric saying, this is our chance, this is, without breaking into song about this is our moment, or, this is the moment we have to do things, it's this point of maximum visibility. We have to do something different. We have to grasp this opportunity. And that creates this exceptional environment of maybe uniform political support, everyone bored, people supporting this, people saying, you know, you're unpatriotic if you don't support this project. This whole sort of momentum that's generated. And that gives us maybe a power to do something quite extraordinary, different, bigger, better maybe than we would otherwise have the chance to do, because we have this momentum and some degree of consensus and this power, this maybe even that will unlock funds to make it even more substantial. But remember, exceptionality in the academic literature is very frowned upon, isn't it? This idea, oh, hang on, why are we making an exception here? The reason we have planning rules or procedures or existing organisations or democratic procedures is for a reason, you know. So we shouldn't make too many exceptions. We shouldn't treat things exceptionally. Everything should be treated within these frameworks. But we know that, not necessarily in London, but certainly in previous host cities, we tend to get established procedures ignored. We tend to get new organisations created, limited life organisations that have new powers, special powers that, you know, are magically invented for the purposes of delivering something. So even, I think in London, a lot of the planning procedures were sort of respected to a large extent, but even when they are, decision makers are sort of seduced by this Olympic effect and they are almost can act themselves quite irrationally. So, for example, in London, I don't know how much you followed a lot of the planning permissions that were sought to develop a lot of the Olympic projects, but you know, all of them had to seek planning permission in the same way that any development project would. But obviously there was a slight concern that the chances of these actually really being turned down were so remote, partly because all the boroughs and officials involved were very much sort of stakeholders in the process. And, you know, there's just an inevitability about the permissions being granted. So it was almost a process of negotiation about, you know, rather than a process of is this or isn't this an appropriate thing to do. So that's quite interesting, this idea of exceptionality. And again, it's a big theme, isn't it, in sort of, I think in urban studies and sort of legal theory studies, and this idea of the state of exception almost becoming the norm, effectively, this idea of the constantly making exceptions, and therefore that almost becoming a new, you know, modus operandi sort of thing. And that's a quite an interesting theme, I think, with which to explore events and other big sort of regeneration projects that have these powerful narratives behind them that say, we should make an exception because it's the Olympic Games and therefore we should allow things that wouldn't normally be tolerated. How's that so far? Are there any questions so far? I don't know if there's a good bridge between the first and the second part of the session. How am I doing for time? Okay, so I'll speak for maybe another 15, 20 minutes. Is that all right? So I said I would say something about maybe other ways of understanding this very complex project, you know, sort of angles, or again, I haven't got time and it's impossible to do justice to the complexities of this London 2012 project. It involves so many different dimensions at different levels, the national scale, local scale. But I wanted to just try and say some things about the work that I'd been doing. So I did spend quite a bit of time talking to some of the people involved, following the enormous amount of documentary material that has been produced. You know, so if any of you have done any Olympic research, you'll know that there's no shortage of planning documents and consultancy reports to read. You know, that was almost the main thing that was produced by all these Olympic organisations. So one way in which I've tried really to understand the project as a whole was a little bit slightly sort of pessimistic, sort of realistic view that really ultimately, if you look through a lot of the rhetoric and what actually happened and how the project unfolded, one way of really understanding was it maybe this was ultimately a vehicle for, you know, de-risking the area for private investment, effectively the public, us, you know, or to a lesser extent you, because you don't have to pay, you know, the council tax in London, but us as generally actually basically funding a sort of de-risking operation whereby developers obviously historically have been reluctant to invest in East London, and the idea was really unlocking the potential of strategic sites, overcoming the stigma of London and the need for coordination to try and overcome existing barriers to development. So ultimately this sort of decision seems to have been made at various points, a very realistic decision that, you know, that was something that the public sector had to do. And this is quite an important thing, isn't it? Because it's about what is the role for the public sector in regeneration? What is the role for public money in regeneration? We've had all 20 years of talk of partnerships and different ways of working. But ultimately, this was quite an old-fashioned project in some ways. It was public money first. Hopefully, if you were one of the sort of people involved, that would then be followed by a suite of private investors willing to sort of put their money in later. There wasn't really a partnership, I don't think. I mean, there was some partnerships involved, obviously, but it was very much us throwing money at it in the short term, hoping that there would be a long-term return on that investment in terms of private funded development. So when I talked to the ODA, I thought this was quite interesting. So the people I talked to generally, I interviewed over the past, or certainly in the period before the Games, people were, you know, they weren't these evil developers, or, you know, they had very good intentions. So it's very easy to cast these people as, you know, sort of not necessarily very helpful, but I think they were trying to do the right thing. So this was quite an interesting perspective, this idea that really what was happening here was that the public sector was really doing all the hard work, basically funding things, and basically trying to open it up for private sector investment. And now you might say, well, that's exactly what urban development is and what urban regeneration, how it works. But I found that slightly depressing, I think, in some ways, because I always think, you know, maybe we should be working on the basis that, you know, we privatise risk and socialise the benefits of that risk. And here we've got an example of where we're socialising the risk and privatising the benefits to a certain extent, aren't we? We're thinking about, we have to shoulder the risk that this investment won't work, but the potential beneficiaries can wait and see how things are working and then move in and actually, you know, presumably benefit financially. If we don't lock in various sort of checks and balances, there's a real danger of losing quite a lot of, you know, basically shoveling public money into sort of private hands effectively. And that's how some academics would put it. I wouldn't go as strongly as that. So this was very similar to, if you followed the Winter Games in Vancouver in 2010, similar thing whereby the government had to really bankroll the thing, even though originally it was set up as being very much a co-funded thing, credit crunch, other factors meant that ultimately the public sector had to pay for things and then hope that their assets and these investments would actually generate profits down the line. But obviously that was no guarantee of that happening. In Vancouver it was much more difficult at that time to realise and to sell a lot of these assets on. So, for example, in London, if you followed the story of the Athletes' Village, of the Media Centre, these were projects which were meant to be paid for by private money, you know, with those investors taking the risk. But actually, because of various problems and the credit crunch, the public sector effectively built these, you know, they funded housing projects, media centres, other facilities, which really was something they wouldn't normally do, I don't think. So it was quite an interesting sort of process, I think, there. And again, there might be lessons and interesting implications for a wider regeneration from that. So the other issues related to this was this idea of the dissolution of public-private partnerships, and also this problem about when events go over budget, as they inevitably do, the first thing to get squeezed is the more progressive sort of regeneration dimension, the sort of affordable housing or the social benefits. Or there's a tendency for these projects to squeeze the bit that actually is the most useful regeneration bit, because the event things, the things we have to do for the event, don't get squeezed because we have to deliver them for this set deadline. So it's a problem that relates back to what I was talking about previously. A more positive way of understanding the whole project was that the people involved seemed to genuinely think that, certainly at the outset, that this wasn't about the Olympics. This was a vehicle. The Olympics was a resource from which we could leverage a more generous vision of regeneration for wider East London. So it wasn't just about Stratford, it was about East London, and that there was there was a great deal of appetite for that, not just amongst you know, the host boroughs, of course they would be up for that, but from the government, from even some of the developers involved and other stakeholders, housing associations, there was an appetite for trying to outperform other cities that only had a very much more localised effect, where there would be some wider vision of regeneration. And so when I talked to lots of different people, they were saying to me, well, this is how we will assess the project down the line. It will be not just in terms of have we built and transformed a wonderful Olympic Park. It will be about, you know, can we sustain improvements in this area? Can we do more than just change things physically? Can we actually make a difference in terms of people's lives, people's quality of life, levels of education, even fundamental things like, you know, mortality rates and health indicators and other broader indicators of genuine regeneration, and that they should be felt well beyond the perimeters of the Olympic Park. So this wasn't just, you know, the view of some idealistic sort of East London advocates. This was the view of, you know, the stakeholders involved, the main authorities involved. So I spoke to a DCLG guy who was very aware of the problems of using events in regeneration. He told me, this is not in itself going to regenerate East London, but we can squeeze this, we can get value out of it. It's not going to necessarily make people healthier or get better. The fundamental problems of this area are educational attainment, worklessness, health and life expectancy. We want to address those issues, so we will use the Olympics as the jumping off point, as the provocation. And there was this idea, it was quite a progressive idea through some of the planning for the Games, certainly from 2009 onwards, that this really was something that we could build into the structures of regeneration in this area, that we were trying to do something a little bit different, a little bit more progressive, a little bit more ambitious. And as I said, that was something shared by First Base is quite an interesting development company. They're part of the consortium who own half of the Athletes' Village. So one of their senior officials, you know, again, we've bought very much into this idea of a broader, more generous vision. And this was all realised in quite an important document, I think, the Strategic Regeneration Framework for the host boroughs. Has anyone come across that document? This idea of the SRF, I don't know. I get used to talking to these people who know what all these things mean, like SRF. And the SRF was this very important document published in 2009, which was trying to achieve this goal of convergence. This idea that the Olympics could deliver substantial change in East London, in that in 20 years' time the host boroughs would offer the same opportunities as the average London borough. Whereas we know that traditionally they've been at the bottom of the rankings of deprivation and other socio-economic indicators. The idea was that various initiatives, including the Games, would be developed in parallel in order to make this sort of transition from being really difficult areas to being sort of median areas when compared to the other the London boroughs. So this was, I mean, whether or not this happens, we don't know yet. Obviously, most of these long-term objectives, we don't know whether they will work because we don't yet have enough, there's not enough time as yet passed. But it was interesting that this project was at least trying to come up with some structures and ideas that would try to link a big physical regeneration project to a broader social economic agenda, a regional agenda, and try and think about how that would actually happen in practice, rather than just using this very, very banal rhetoric of catalysts and halo effects and effects radiating out magically to the area. So this idea was we're going to plan this. We're not just going to hope that the Olympic Park will suddenly have this, you know, ripple effect whereby the effects of that one site will suddenly start changing areas near to it. We're actually going to try and build that into planning policy, into other strategic agendas in East London. So one of the great triumphs of the people behind this project was they managed to get it into the London plan, the statutory spatial plan for London, that now projects in this area have to demonstrate, one of the conditions they have to demonstrate often is that they contribute to the convergence agenda, that they actually can demonstrate how their development, how their housing scheme or how their retail project, whatever it may be, mixed use project, how that will actually contribute to this convergence agenda, which is about this 20-year project to realise socio-economic change in East London. Now, there's always a but here, isn't there? You know, we can't really finish on a positive sort of, well, isn't that wonderful? Because there's always things didn't quite work out as they seem. And unfortunately, over time, over the last year or two, there has been a bit of a loss of momentum on that convergence agenda, I think. I mean, that's speaking from the outside. So what this gentleman mentioned in 2010 seems to be happening. This is a tragedy in the true sense of the word, in the literal sense of the word, in that it's an inevitable problem that's actually being realised, that actually what everyone is now getting too obsessed with, that localised site, that politicians and other stakeholders are spending a lot of time worrying about what's happening in this relatively confined part of East London, and we're worrying less about what's happening in the broader region. So this obsession with what we will do with the stadium and this, this constant sort of bankrolling of like the Olympic Park sort of conversion, actually, again, sort of narrows our focus, and actually we are starting to think about the Olympic Park as a regeneration project in itself, rather than the original vision, which was actually that the Olympic Park would be this engine and be the means to achieve the regeneration of East London, which doesn't, as with the quote before said, doesn't equal regeneration of the Olympic Park. It means the regeneration of the wider region. And it's not hard to work out why that's happening. The political capital that is at stake here is enormous. The mayor and other stakeholders are very keen for the very visible aspects of the Olympic project to be seen to have worked. That means the stadium and other very relatively, I think, insignificant but iconic projects. Whereas the much more difficult stuff, the less sexy stuff, gets a little bit neglected, and that means that some of these ambitious and very, very impressive ambitions are perhaps being neglected. So you'll be very relieved to know that that's me coming towards the end of my rant or presentation, whichever interpretation you prefer. I'm really keen to get some of your observations to see if what I said stacks up with your own disciplinary knowledge and experience and ideas, especially when it comes to some of the tricky parts about governance and partnerships and political economy, which I don't profess to be the world's expert on. I think in terms of concluding, one thing that's interesting to think about is, well, does it really matter? Why is there so much academic work on these mega events? And does it, in the whole scheme of things, is this relationship between events and regeneration that important? Can we really benefit from this very, very large amount of material and work that's been dedicated to that theme? And obviously, quite selfishly, I would say yes, it does matter. And these things do deserve attention, not only because they're really interesting and fascinating, but these are big projects, and they're ongoing projects in many instances, and they're worthy of proper consideration and scrutiny. And remember, they're ongoing. I mean, this is the Carpenter's estate in London, which is outside what you would think of being Olympic Park, but is actually within the perimeter of the Olympic of the London Legacy Development Corporation's territory. This is obviously an estate now which people have been gradually evicted from. So Olympic regeneration continues in East London. Even some of the more pernicious aspects of regeneration. So these are important issues, and it's not just about London. There's a constant stream of new events emerging, and despite all the pessimism and all the sort of retrospective work that's been done on the events, there's still a real appetite among cities to stage these events and to use them in regeneration. So I see one role of the academy, as it were, is to actually think about, not just to oppose these things and to moan about them, but to actually suggest how they should be done better. I think there is an inevitability about these things are going to happen and continue to happen. So we need to think about how these projects could be done better, even if we don't necessarily support the original premise for them, which is that events aren't particularly sort of useful regeneration tools. But it seems as though cities are keen to link these things together. So we need to think about how they could work, even if in the past they haven't worked. And more than that, I think there is a case. I mean, I presume there's quite a few sort of students, a few undergraduate students, master students in the audience, and for me, these type of projects have been a really useful way into understanding much more general processes. And I think for the public even, their understanding of regeneration is actually greatly assisted by these types of projects, because they're reading, certainly in London, people have read for the last 10 years about regeneration, and the public knowledge and awareness of some of the issues about gentrification and about planning and about other aspects of regeneration, have been greatly enhanced, I think, by the sort of public sort of discourses and the consideration of these issues in the public sphere. So I think that, again, that's a further justification for, looking at these projects in detail and using them as a way of understanding more general processes, either to get people to learn more about key issues and key concepts, or, to get them actively involved in regeneration projects in their local areas. But that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Who'd like to break the ice?
Hi.
Chapman.
Shall I stand up? It's a good question. You always have to start your piece of work. It's a very difficult question, because it has been it's a word a bit like other sort of commonly used words in academia that sort of started off being really important, but actually have gradually drifted off, and their meaning has drifted off. But it is about social, economic and physical change, and sustaining that change, and obviously positive change in areas that have suffered. So the whole point of regeneration is that it's not development, it's actually trying to restore function and trying to recover economic sort of practices. And so for me, I've always understood it really as being about sort of trying to help to deal with the problems in the past and trying to overcome them. It's not starting with a blank canvas and doing something different. It's trying to work with what is there and trying to sort of improve the situation, but across the range of physical but also social and economic sort of practices. And again, the work I did with the RSCS, it was really interesting because they had a very different interpretation from us about what regeneration meant. So it led to some quite awkward discussions about what we do, what's this project about, because for us it was about the lives of people in East London, but for them that was very much a welfare issue, and that regeneration for the RSCS was much more about providing the physical dimension of that process, and actually leaving the sort of social and economic dimension to those organisations that they felt were more adept at dealing with them. So it was some interesting conversations there. But for me, it is a very broad-ranging thing, and that's why in some ways it's become quite not a meaningless term, but it's a term which is more difficult to justify now, because it's got such a broad stretch, hasn't it?